Hello and welcome back. In the previous lesson, we touched on the account and services layer and learned more about that. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the physical and networking layer. So let's start off by talking about what this is. And the physical and networking layer represents the global infrastructure of AWS in terms of where resources are physically located around the world and how data flows through the AWS network. So this layer is all about how AWS is organized and how internal and external communication with AWS works. So as we talked earlier about the account and services layer and how we manage services through the console or the CLI, here we're going to talk about how physically AWS is set up around the world, meaning where their actual hardware is located that we're using, and then how both customers and AWS users interact and manage with that from a networking standpoint. So if we look up top here, we see we have two groups now. We have customers for front end or public access to either our web applications or our EC2 instances, which would generally be through a web browser HTTP protocol in terms of if we're looking at this from the standpoint of a web application. And then also our back end or private users, so our AWS users, and how they access, say, an EC2 instance or manage an RDS database through protocols like SSH or RDP, and how that comes across the open internet into the AWS infrastructure container. But first, before we actually get into the networking inside of AWS, we have to talk about regions and availability zones. So AWS, in terms of its global infrastructure, is broken up at the highest level between AWS regions and AWS edge locations. So let's first talk quickly about an edge location. An edge location is an AWS data center which does not contain any AWS services. Instead, it is used to deliver content to parts of the world. So an example of this, and we're going to talk about CloudFront much later in this course, but an example would be CloudFront, which is a content delivery network. So this is an example of caching items. So a cached item such as a PDF file can be cached on an edge location, which reduces the amount of space, time, or latency required for requests from that part of the world. So edge locations are located all around the world and allows us to put data or cache data in specific regions of the world where we want that content to be closer to the customers who are going to be accessing it. Next, we want to take a look at regions. So regions, again, are located all around the world, and diving into a region, which we just did by clicking on this, we see that inside of a region, it is comprised of availability zones. But what exactly is a region again? So let's just click on this here and take a look at regions and where they're currently located. So AWS is made up of regions, which are a grouping of independently separated data centers in a specific geographical region known as availability zones. So availability of regions allows the architect to design applications to conform to specific laws and regulations for specific parts of the world. So if we take a look at the map down here, this is a current map as of January 2017 of all of the availability zones and where they're located around the world. So if we take a look at the United States, there's currently 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I believe this one up here is up in Canada, as well as some over in Europe, over in Asia, India, Australia, and in South America. So these are actual areas which are made up of availability zones, which we're going to get to in a second, but the regions are actually where the AWS data centers are located. So when you provision something like an EC2 instance or you store data in S3 and you select the region that is provisioned in or stored in, you're selecting these physical locations to actually store that data. And one of the great things is that you may have an organization that has certain rules, requirements, you have to follow certain government protocols, and therefore you can place data in the proper location around the world to meet any of those standards that you may have to. So another important thing is to understand is that some AWS services do work globally and not within a specific region. An example of that will be IAM, which we're going to get to in the next section. So again, understanding that, go back here, that AWS is made up of regions and edge locations. Within each region, there are multiple availability zones. So looking at an availability zone, the availability zones are where the actual data centers are located. So within a region, there's generally 3 or 4 availability zones. And availability zones, taking a look at the definition of these, availability zones work together in a region to make up a collection of AWS resources. But properly designing applications will utilize multiple availability zones for fault tolerance and failover. And this is because availability zones have direct low latency connections between themselves within a region to be able to share data and back things up amongst themselves, but also remain physically isolated from each other to again maintain that fault tolerance. So within a region, let's say the Virginia Northeast region, there are several availability zones which are physically separated from each other within the Northeast region. Then within each availability zone, there are then multiple data centers which are also physically separated from each other. And then they are all connected to each other through high-speed, low-latency connections so that if you store something, say in an S3 bucket in this availability zone in this data center, it is going to be synced across other availability zones and other data centers as a part of S3's commitment to durability and availability. So it's just very important to understand how AWS is physically set up around the world because it is the foundation of how AWS infrastructure allows you as a solutions architect to build highly available and fault-tolerant systems. So again, to run through this quickly, at the highest level, AWS is made up of regions and edge locations. Inside each region are generally 3 to 4 availability zones, and availability zones are physically separated from each other but are connected through low latency, high-speed internet connections. And then inside each availability zone is where you actually find the AWS data centers that actually house all of the services, all of the servers that you provision when you provision an EC2 instance, or the hard drives that are used when you store things in, say, something like S3. And then as we move further in the VPC networking, this is now when we start to talk about the actual networking and the services that AWS has to set up specific networking type applications. And this is something that we're going to go into in great detail a little bit later in this course. But for now, I just wanted you to get a brief understanding of the physical and networking layer, what it represents, and how it works. And with that, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.